This episode of the Religious Studies Project is brought to you in association with the postgraduate programs in Religious Studies at the University of Edinburgh. David and I are both products of the Edinburgh system. Lots of the other RSP regulars are, and we'd encourage you to check out the link on the podcast page this week to find out more about the taught and research programs that you can do in RS at Edinburgh. Welcome back to the Religious Studies Project, folks. It's David and Chris, your favourite Scots-Irish combo.
I can't think of another Scots-Irish combo right now. It's good to be back. The summer certainly flew by.
It did, absolutely. And lots changed. We're going into now year 6.
Year 6.
Academic year 6 of the Religious Studies Project. And I think this is the first time that both David and I have been in
employment.
Legitimately ill-gotten gains from academia. So it's So
that's changed the game completely. We're going to be very conservative from now on. We'll feature a lot more theology, and we won't criticize anyone because then we won't get tenure.
And on that note, here's the first interview with that new new vibe. We're only joking, folks, but it's an interview that David recorded with Rob Gleave on Islamic Millennialism. So we'll pass over to David, and then we'll tell you some more stuff afterwards.
I'm here in Bedford at the cenSAMM conference for millennialism and violence, and I'm joined by Rob Gleave, who is the director of the Centre for the Study of Islam at Exeter University.
Yep.
And first of all, welcome to the Religious Studies Project.
Thanks very much.
Today we're going to talk about millennialism and violence in Islam, in the Islamic world. Maybe a good place to start is to tell us a little bit about the whole idea of millennialism, messianism in Islam. Is this something that comes from the Quran, or what's the background?
There's clear indications in the Quran about an end time. There's a shortage on detail as to what's going to happen, and a timeline as to when things are going to happen, but there is a discussion, extensive discussion, of something called the hour. And this hour is the hour that will come is the time when the world will be brought to an end, and a judgment will happen, and a resurrection from people who have died will occur from people from the graves, and there's some indication in the Quran itself about some of the violent catastrophic events that will happen in terms of sky and mountains being torn asunder and those sorts of things. But there's not a great detail, and there's not a description of a series of events that will eventually lead up to this event. So there's a strong notion in the Quran that the world will come to an end. But like many things in the Quran, it's indicative, or rather it indicates something, but it doesn't always spell it out in detail, and that was left to Muslim theologians to try and discover what it was that the scriptures were referring to.
Okay.
And for that they used some sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. And there were sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and of course there's huge debates about the authenticity of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, but nonetheless there was a sort of like a residue of statements by the Prophet Muhammad which described various things that were going to happen at the end of the world. And from these sources, a number of different versions, if you like, of the end times were developed in Muslim theology. And the crucial point is that whilst belief in the eventual day of judgment is an essential element of Islamic belief, precisely what will happen at those end times, the details, the sequence of events, if you like, this is not an essential element of Muslim belief. It's not something which determines whether someone is a believer or not a believer.
Yeah.
So it was left open for the Muslim theologians to interpret this material in ways which was highly imaginative. There were some stock elements that always reoccurred. The first one was the return of Jesus. Mm-hmm. So this was an important element. The return of Jesus was seen as a crucial element of the end times.
Which might come as quite a surprise to some of our listeners, I think.
Well, yes. I mean, Jesus, of course, is highly regarded in Muslim theology as one of the prophets sent by God. Mm-hmm. But the Quran itself indicates that Jesus will return, or that the return of Jesus is one of the signs of the end times. And often it's linked by theologians to the Quranic ambiguity about whether or not Jesus died on the cross. And the Quranic phrase seems to indicate that he appeared to die but didn't die, and therefore it left the way open for a return of Jesus at the end times. And it's very likely historically that this was incorporated into the Muslim theological framework from Christian roots about the return of Jesus. But it was a crucial element of the end time narrative for Muslims, that the return of Jesus will come. Another crucial element was also the return of another figure known as the Mahdi. Yeah. And the Sunni and Shi'i branches of Islam have slightly different notions of what this Mahdi will do and what his role is theologically and as well as physically in the end times. So they have slightly different notions of that. But these two elements are always conjoined, that the Mahdi and the return of Jesus together will bring about the ushering in, if you like, of the end of the world.
And a lot of the imagery there, as you say, it's very reminiscent of the kind of Christian story and the imagery of, imagery which carries on into some of the new religious kind of millennialisms we've been talking about this week.
Yeah, I think apocalyptic imagery is something which, it's a discourse which is shared, I think, across the Jewish, Christian and Muslim milieu. Absolutely. And used across these different religious traditions, and reused again and again. Mm-hmm. You find it reinvented in new religious movements within Islam as well, which emphasize the coming of the end time. So it's a stock, if you like, of imagery, which is not exclusive to an individual tradition. Yeah. And quite often, the ability for apocalyptic imagery to cross-fertilize between religious traditions is sometimes more, and there's more potential for that. Absolutely. than in other areas of theology or in ethics or in law. That in apocalyptic, somehow a shared stock of images about the beast, the Antichrist, the return of Jesus, all of these things together can be shared across traditions.
Absolutely.
And you also find with a lot of apocalyptic movements that they're quite willing to borrow from different traditions, and they don't feel any reticence about the sources of their religious imagery. Muslim religious movements, quite often, they will take something which we find in the Jewish or Christian traditions, which have made their way into Islam in one way or another through the history of Islam, and they're not worried about the sources of these things when they're constructing their end of time narrative.
Of course not. Yeah.
So it makes for an enormously creative image of the end of the world when apocalyptic writers are able to draw on a great wealth of writings and sources in their creative imagination about what the end of the world will look like.
The theology and ideas about the Mahdi in particular is quite important in the history of the sort of schism between the Sunni and Shia traditions. Am I right in saying that?
Absolutely. I mean, for the Sunni traditions, the Mahdi is a figure sent by God who will lead a battle and bring about the preparations, if you like, for the Day of Judgment. In the Shiite tradition, the Mahdi is the return of someone, or the reappearance of someone who disappeared in the 9th century, and who will return and re-establish, if you like, their rightful legitimate political rule at some time in the future. So whilst the Shiite and Sunni traditions didn't divide over the question of the end times, at the beginning it was a question over who should lead the community and what the role of that leader should be. The way in which the Shiite tradition developed was that following the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632, there was a series of leaders coming from amongst his family, his descendants, who were seen as blessed with special religious knowledge. And for one particular branch of the Shiite tradition, there were 12 such leaders. And the last of these has gone into hiding. And this is the promised Mahdi, the promised messianic figure that will reappear at some point in the end of time. No one knows when, but Twelver Shi'ites, as they're called, because they believe in 12 leaders after the Prophet Muhammad. Twelver Shi'ites have a very strong notion of the patience that's required in expectation of the return of the Mahdi, and the internal striving towards to be a perfect servant. I suppose so. The internal striving to be a perfect servant becomes a crucial element of Shiite identity in the expectation of the return of the Mahdi at some point in time in the future. And when the Mahdi returns, it's not simply that this person will be a military leader and bring about the end of days. This is the return of the person who should have been the leader of the Muslim community for all of these centuries. It's the reappearance, if you like, of the Mahdi, who is present in the community but unknown, suddenly making himself known again. So this is quite a different dynamic for Shiites about the end times compared to Sunnis. Since the Mahdi is someone who's seen as having perfect knowledge of divine matters, including the law, this means that he's looked to by Shiites as a guide for daily living in a way which the Mahdi doesn't fulfill such a role in Sunni theology.
It's a really fascinating and I think kind of unique situation, this idea of the Mahdi being this occulted figure who's gone into hiding but is still in the world but hidden, and they're waiting on his. It's not like a physical reincarnation or anything like that. It's a re-emergence of this hidden figure, it's a really interesting.
It was a belief which emerged in early Islam through a series of descendants of the Prophet Muhammad who went into hiding in order to protect themselves and the community from oppression from the majority Sunni community. And the theme of a hidden imam who will make themselves known again when the conditions are right became incorporated into Twelver Shi'ite doctrine and became a sort of official element of Twelver Shi'ite belief. And that's something which is unusual, since most apocalyptic movements which have a messianic element think of the Messiah as returning to earth from somewhere else.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whereas for the Shiites, the presence of the hidden imam, the Mahdi, in the community means that at certain points they can find out what his opinion is.
Yeah.
Which is the crucial element for Shiites. How do you know what the imam's opinion might be on this or that matter? So, for example, if all the community agree on something, on a particular doctrine, then Shiites have imagined that, well, one of the people who agree must be the hidden imam.
Yeah.
So the agreement suddenly becomes authoritative because the imam's opinion must be amongst the people who are agreeing. We don't know which opinion it is. We don't know the identity of the individual. But because everyone's agreeing, the imam must be within that agreement. And the result is that certain new doctrines might be validated by a community agreement. The theoretical possibility, if you like, of communication from the hidden imam through community agreement becomes possible.
And I can see that being a very powerful narrative, because in other traditions where you want to have the prophetic figure who is no longer with you refer to present events, you either have to create a new revelation, through a new prophet, or you discover or reveal some previously unknown writings, the way that has happened in Buddhism quite a lot, for instance. But this you can actually quite legitimately have this figure referring to events of the day, quite contemporaneously, because he's still around. We just don't know where.
He's present, yes. And that creates a notion of immanence within the community, which has become very important for Shiite devotional practice, in the sense that, the Twelver Shi'ites will often pray to hasten the reappearance of the Mahdi as part of their personal devotional prayers. Is that they believe that that through devotional acts one is contributing to the situation where the imam who is present can make themselves known, and it creates an internal, what you might call, piety within the religious tradition, which is a dynamic you can't find in Sunni Islam, because of the presence of the imam in the community, the imagined presence of the imam in the community. It means that there's an emphasis on the importance, if you like, of ensuring community cohesion.
And does that spill out then into how millenarian ideas and prophetic ideas affect the community then? Would we see a difference between the way that Shiites and Sunnis relate to how messianism plays into their actions in the political sphere?
Well, certainly within Shiism, the fact that the imam is present and needs to be revealed has enabled certain claimants at different points in time to be the Mahdi, when, without them claiming this from the very beginning, because the revealing nature of them being present, but then revealing that they're the Mahdi, is in a sense an extension of the basic theological doctrine.
Absolutely.
So you often find that within the Shiite tradition, when an individual has claimed to be the Mahdi, they haven't needed to claim it straight away, because their presence in the community without being the Mahdi isn't a source of scandal, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
To their claim.
Yeah, it makes perfect
sense. Because
the
the imam decides when the time is right to appear, and the claimant can reliably or legitimately claim, well, it wasn't the right time for me to make my personality known. And so it means that within the Twelver Shi'ite tradition, claiming the appearance of the Mahdi, or claiming to be the Mahdi through appearance, has a very strong potential. It's like a trigger, which is always loaded and ready to be fired at any point in time when the conditions are right, or the individual personality believes themselves to be fulfilling that particular role. And so there have been claims of people being the messianic figure throughout the history of Islam, not just in Shi'i Islam. But when the claim happens in Shi'i Islam, the individual is claiming more than just being a military leader. They're claiming a special sort of knowledge, which is, I suppose, akin to a form of prophecy, although the Muslim theological doctrine means that prophecy ends with the Prophet Muhammad. Even for Shiites, it's another form of divine knowledge communicated to an individual, but it's high potentially, well, put it this way, the potentiality within Shiism for a claimant to put themselves forward is always there because of the notion of an imam present in the community who is just waiting to be revealed.
Yeah, you don't have to posit a new prophet or messiah or anything like that. The potential is already there and part of the actual theological position.
And of course, there is a huge taboo in Islam around positing yourself as a new prophet.
Yes, exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because it contravenes one of the basic doctrines of Islam, which is that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, and that there is no prophet after Muhammad. And so Sunni groups, or groups which have emerged out of Sunnism, such as the Ahmadi movement, for example, have been treated with such strong criticism by the rest of the Sunni Muslim community because they have contravened this notion of the end of prophecy with the Prophet Muhammad. They've claimed to have a leader who is a new prophet. In the view of Sunni Islam, the Ahmadi community has claimed that its founder is a new prophet. In Shi'i Islam, the messianic figure is the hidden imam rather than a new prophet.
Yes, exactly.
Which in a sense is slightly less of a taboo element within the theological framework.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it would be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
To move to the Sunni world then, it would be remiss of me if I didn't ask you about ISIS. And there seems to be some debate, the degree to which they should be seen as a millennial, even apocalyptic kind of movement. I myself would like to hear some from you, your sort of take on this. Is the apocalyptic millennial aspects of it being overplayed by the West because of fears and ignorance, or is this something that is theologically driving them?
Well, my own view is that there has been a certain hyping up, if you like, of the apocalyptic element because it makes good journalism. I mean, the apocalypticism is always a sensationalist story for journalists in the contemporary period because it's seen as so out there and weird and bizarre. And that, in a sense, accusations of being over-apocalyptic or the attraction, if you like, of the story of an apocalyptic movement is a reflection as much, if you like, of the state of let's say, British society and the nature of secularism and the so-called rationality. And these are seen as hyper-irrational and consequently extremely interesting. And that's certainly been, I think, an element in the attraction of journalists and some commentators as well to the apocalyptic element of the Islamic State message. Having said that, there are strong elements within the Islamic State propaganda machine which indicate that they are quite willing to use apocalyptic imagery to describe and recruit for their military campaign. So the most famous one being the small Syrian village of Darbiq, which is mentioned in a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad that this will be a place where the end times battle will take place. Yeah. So it became very important that Islamic State captured this village and that they used it in their propaganda, in particular their English language propaganda magazine, which they titled the Darbiq. And so they are quite happy to try and use that rhetoric within their propaganda. The big question is how much of their activities are driven by apocalyptic beliefs. Mm-hmm. And in that, I'm slightly less convinced of the primacy of apocalypticism within their military strategy, because most of the things, and the way in which they organize their state, because most of the ways in which they argue for this policy or this action or that action, you can trace back to traditional ways of thinking about the assessment of actions within the Islamic legal tradition. Mm-hmm. They argue using legal reasoning, which you find in the traditional sources, and they themselves are always trying to demonstrate that their opinion is not an unusual opinion compared to the traditional sources. So apocalypticism doesn't really figure, I don't think, in the internal organization of Islamic State and the justification for some of their actions. It's extremely important in the way in which they project themselves to the outside world, and this notion that they can recruit through this rhetoric, the fear of missing out on the success and ultimate end times, which Islamic State play a role in, is an incredibly powerful tool for them to attract new recruits.
Absolutely. So that that interest that comes from the media, and they're doing exactly the same thing and using it to attract attention to what they're talking about. And as you say as well, this is such a powerful set of imagery and a deep set and long-running narrative in kind of human culture that it always seems to be there as a little reservoir that you can tap into.
And don't underestimate Islamic State's awareness of this.
Absolutely.
They know, they have quite a sophisticated media machine which produces quite sophisticated propaganda materials. And they know that apocalyptic fears are an element within Western society, and Muslims living outside of Muslim majority contexts are the prime targets for that propaganda and recruitment. And the result is that they know how to use that in order to gain recruits. And so it's certainly an element of their rhetoric and an element of their propaganda. How instrumental it is, how much they instrumentally use it in order to do this, and how much it's actually embedded within the movement is a matter of some debate. Part of the problem is the actual internal workings of Islamic State are quite secretive by necessity, or inevitably, you might say. Mm-hmm. So precisely what the apocalyptic beliefs of their leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, might be, outside of the propaganda element, is actually quite difficult to identify. But it's certainly a form of religiosity that they are very happy to project outside of the territory which they control.
That's an excellent comparative point to end on. I think it's very important that we don't simply ascribe naive beliefs to any of these kind of millennial apocalyptic discourses, be they in Islam, Christianity, new religions, popular culture. There are multiple levels of discourse going on all the time, and they're being used sometimes for their their media impact or their interest as much as they are themselves driving actions.
No, we make a mistake if we think that an organisation like Islamic State is a simple organisation with a single message, that it's always churning out. It's actually quite a complicated, multi-tiered, multifaceted organisation which knows and which through experience has learnt what works and what doesn't work in different contexts.
Yeah.
And like all organisations, it promotes itself in appropriate ways to appropriate audiences.
And that people are driven naively by beliefs and ideologies, and in fact, it's much more complicated, and they're mutually creating them.
No, certainly, and we make a mistake if we think that all we need to do is really try and show these people what the truth is and how mistaken they are through a forceful argumentation that we're going to convince them in some way. No, people believe things, and belief, as we know, is a really complex set of factors which lead to an individual settling upon a particular doctrine as the one which they believe is right for them, and belief in the providential nature of Islamic State is one such belief. It's not simple. It's actually extremely complicated and complex as a process, just as complicated as any process of religious commitment.
Rob Gleave, thank you so much for taking part in our sophisticated media and propaganda machine at the Religious Studies Project. I'm afraid it's time for us to look to the future and the next panel here at the conference. So thanks again for taking part.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
You're quite welcome.
So I hope you all enjoyed that interview that was recorded at the cenSAMM conference on apocalypticism way back about April, I think it was.
Yes, well, it could have been the 4th of July or the 7th of April.
It was the 7th of April. The 4th of July was probably when I got round to actually uploading it into the system. Slightly echoey audio, more echoey than we might like, but it was necessary in order to speak to Rob. I think you'll agree it was worth it. But there is, of course, a transcription available on the website. Just look for the link on the page.
Yeah, so thanks very much to Helen Bradstock as well for producing that. We've also had a couple of cenSAMM calls for papers have gone out in the last Opportunities Digest on the website, so do check those out as well.
They were, if you're thinking of attending, they're free, and they're also available. All of the interviews, all of the presentations that they do are streamed live at the time and then put up in high quality later on YouTube. So, do get involved. It's well worth it.
Yeah, so you can go on there and hear my good friend Dr. David Robertson speaking. Just to flag up what's coming next week, we've got a new interviewer, Ella Bach, who's recorded an interview with some friends of the RSP, Steve Jacobs and Theodore Wildcroft, on Hindu traditions in contemporary British communities. So we're looking forward to bringing you that next week. And we've just both recently been at the BASR conference, our beneficent sponsors, down in Chester.
Yeah. We recorded about 60 gigabytes of data when we were there, Chris. Could you believe that?
Well, you recorded about 60 gigabytes.
Yeah, well, you were involved in some of that, at least peripherally.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Christmas special, video roundtable on Edward Tyler. We've got Brianne was there, did an interview for us. Jonathan was rushing around videoing everybody. So we got lots of stuff to come over. Probably this year, but we've got so many interviews at this point in the bag that we're starting to schedule into the new year as well.
Absolutely. And this week you'll get the first response edited by Jonathan Tuckett going up towards the end of the week. So do listen out for that. I think that's probably all the news we've got for you this week. But from Dr. David Robertson of the Open University and Dr. Chris Cotter of the University of Edinburgh,
thanks for listening. The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett and our Opportunities Digest by Jana Shirley. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock with audio assistance from Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop.
Don't forget you can support the project using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or by donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.